Welcome to Dark Ascent. Today I'll cover a couple who called their Sherpas slaves the whole way up Kangchenjunga, never realizing those were the only men who could get them home. They hired one of the strongest teams on Earth's third highest mountain and spent weeks disregarding their skills and treating those experts like property. But what happened to them near the top was so merciless that even I was left traumatized. It was October 14th, 2019, and somewhere on the long descent off Kangchenjunga, above 26,000 feet, Cassius and Candel Bruno were sitting down in the snow for the last time, waiting for the very men they had spent the whole expedition treating like servants to climb back up through the cold and carry them home. Kangchenjunga is the third highest mountain in the world, just over 28,000 feet of rock and ice on the border of Nepal and India, and its name means the five treasures of the snow, for the five great summits along its crown. It was first climbed in 1955, and out of respect for the people who hold it sacred, that first team stopped a few feet short of the true summit, a promise many climbers still keep today. It is one of the three deadliest of all the 8,000ers, a mountain that has killed more than 50 of the people who have tried it, and most of that killing happens on the way down, on the long, exhausted descent. And there is one fact that matters more than all the rest. It is so high and so remote that no helicopter can reach you up where it counts. On Kangchenjunga, the only rescue that exists is the people you climbed with. That is the mountain Cassius and Candel Bruno decided they had bought. Weeks before they flew out, Candel had already turned the climb into an event for the hundreds of thousands of people who followed her. There was the announcement video, shot in their kitchen with the gear laid out like a product launch. The two of them talking about chasing the impossible. She listed the sponsors, the watch and the supplement brand and the apparel line, and explained that this was the biggest, boldest thing they had ever taken on, a peak most people had never even heard of. She talked about the elite team they had assembled, the guides and the Sherpas, and the logistics, the way a producer talks about a crew. She told everyone to follow along because they would post from every camp all the way to the top, and promised it would be the most incredible content she had ever made. There is one thing about this I will never understand. You hand your life to a team of experts, and then you treat those same people like servants you can barely stand, because that is the strange, ugly heart of this whole story. Getting to Kangchenjunga is itself an expedition, a long walk for days through some of the most remote country in Nepal, far from roads, far from hospitals, far from the safety nets the Brunos had always assumed would be close. The deeper the trail wound into that valley, the more completely their survival passed into the hands of the men carrying their loads, and the less either of them seemed to notice. Candel filmed the porters and Sherpas as scenery. Cassius counted the days and the dollars, and neither seemed to register that they were walking, step by step, into a place where the only thing that would keep them alive was other people. Cassius Bruno was 35, and Candel was 32, and they had built a life that looked, from the outside, like a highlight reel. Cassius had made a great deal of money early and fast in the right corner of the tech and crypto world, and Candel had turned their life of travel and training into a following worth a fortune of its own. They were used to a world that answered to them, where money opened every door and quietly turned almost any person into someone who worked for them. They had come to believe, without ever quite saying it out loud, that the world divided cleanly into the people who paid and the people who were paid. The trouble is that a mountain does not take payment. It does not care who you are, and it keeps no record of how important you had decided you were. The posts kept coming as they trekked in, and a pattern showed up fast. Candel shot constant footage of the Sherpas, but never as people, always as background, the strong silent locals carrying the heavy bags, set to music, captioned with a line about the team that made her dream possible. She called them her staff. In one caption, she called them the help. She filmed them pitching the tents and cooking the meals and hauling the loads, and posted it all as proof of how well supported the expedition was, never once putting a name to a single face. The men were props in the story she was selling, and the comments rolled in calling her brave and an inspiration, not one of them seeing that the strongest people in every frame were the ones she never bothered to name. To me, the saddest part of all of it was the way she filmed those men. Never once as people, only ever treating them like objects and decoration for her videos. On paper, the Brunos were not beginners, and that was part of the problem. 2 years earlier, they had stood on the summit of Everest, on a fully guided permit where a team of Sherpas fixed every rope, carried every load, and walked them up the mountain almost by the hand. To Cassius and Candel, that summit had proved they were real mountaineers. What it had actually proved was that enough money and Sherpa support could carry 2 reasonably fit people up even the highest mountain on Earth. They owed that summit, every step of it, to men exactly like the ones now carrying their bags toward Kangchenjunga, and it had taught them not a shred of humility. When an outfitter in Kathmandu agreed to put them on a mountain this serious, on the strength of that Everest tick and the size of their deposit, the last thing between the Brunos and Kangchenjunga was money, and money they had. From base camp, Candel posted the photo everyone had been waiting for, the cluster of tents on the glacier, with the great wall of the mountain rising behind them, the prayer flag strung over everything, impossibly beautiful in the thin, clear light. She made a point of how few other teams were even up there with them this late in the year, just a couple of small expeditions on the whole mountain, as if the emptiness proved how bold they were. She wrote about how surreal it felt to finally be here, how hard they had worked, how many had doubted them. She mentioned the head Sherpa, a quiet older man she did not name, and noted with a little laugh that the guides were almost too careful, always wanting to wait another day, always going on about the snow and the weather and turning back, and that she and Cassius had not come all this way to be slowed down by other people's nerves. She signed off saying the team was strong and the summit close, and that the next time they heard from her, she would be standing higher than almost anyone they knew ever had. At base camp, the Brunos met the men who would actually keep them alive, a team led by a Sirdar named Sonam, with a younger steady climbing Sherpa named Tashi among them. On a properly run expedition, each client climbs the hard ground with his own personal Sherpa. So high on the mountain, it would fall to Sonam to shadow the one of them, and to Tashi the other, to clip them to the ropes, wash their oxygen, and read the danger they could not. Sonam was in his late 40s and had been climbing these peaks since he was a boy. He had summited Kangchenjunga itself and several other 8,000ers, and just as importantly had turned back from a few of them, short of the top, and walked home alive, the rarer skill by far. It did not take him long to read Cassius and Candel Bruno, and what he saw settled into him as a worry he had learned long ago never to ignore. What absolutely crushes me is that Sonam saw these two coming from the very first day. He knew exactly how it would end, and he tied himself to them and climbed anyway. Cassius kept his own running notes, not for the public but for himself, the way he tracked everything, and they read like a man auditing an investment. He logged what the expedition was costing him almost to the day, the permits, the oxygen, the guides, the porters, and he wrote about the Sherpas the way he wrote about any other line he was paying for, as a units of labor that were his to direct. He noted with satisfaction that the men did whatever he told them and never pushed back for long, and wrote that this was what real money bought you here. Total control, a crew that moved the moment you said move. There was not one line about who these men were or what they had survived. To Cassius, they were not people he climbed with. They were people he had purchased for the season, and he had started to talk about them that way out loud. It came to a head at base camp over loads and money. Sonam had asked, calmly and respectfully, that the men's loads be kept to a safe weight, because the climbing ahead was long and the carries brutal, and Cassius had not taken it well. In front of other climbers and several of the Sherpas, he said the thing that would follow this story for as long as anyone tells it. He said that for what he was paying, he had not hired guides or partners of any kind. He had bought slaves, and that these men were his to command until he was standing on the summit. He used that word, slaves, and he used it more than once, plainly, as if it were simply the truth of the arrangement. The Sherpas heard every syllable of it. Sonam said nothing at all. He turned and went back to the work, because the work was the only thing on that whole mountain that was ever going to bring these two people home alive. I have heard ugly things from clients who think money makes them climbers, but calling those men slaves, the men about to risk their lives for him, is the lowest thing I have ever heard up there. The rotations up the mountain only sharpened it. Climbing a peak like this means going up and coming back down several times before any summit attempt, sleeping a little higher each round. And on every one of those trips, the Brunos pushed a punishing pace, not because they were strong, but because Candel wanted the footage and Cassius wanted to be done before the short post-monsoon season slammed shut and the real cold came in. They drove the Sherpas to carry more and move faster, and when the couple themselves lagged, slow and gasping and stopping every few steps, they found ways to blame the men around them for it. Sonam tried more than once to slow them down, to talk about rest and snow and the long descent waiting at the end, and each time they heard him out with the patience you give the hired help, and then did exactly what they had already planned. Candel's posts through their rotations were relentlessly triumphant. She filmed the sunrises and the two of them looking strong on the fixed lines, and wrote about grit and discipline and refusing to make excuses, about how the only thing between a person and their dreams was a willingness to suffer. When a rotation went badly, when the altitude flattened them, and they came down gray and shaking, none of that reached the page. It was cut around and repackaged into one more clip about pushing through. She posted a video of Tashi fixing a hard section of rope, sped up and set to music, captioned as a glimpse of the incredible team behind their journey, and never mentioned that the incredible team had just dragged the two of them up ground they had no business being on. The story she sold got braver every rotation, exactly as the real one got more dangerous. The route ground its way up through a string of camps, from base camp on the glacier at around 17,000 feet to a high camp above 24,000 feet, with the summit still more than 3,000 feet of brutal climbing above that. The slopes up high run long and steep, 45 and 50 degrees of hard snow and exposed ice, the kind of ground where an exhausted climber who slips does not always stop. It was late in the post-monsoon season, the mountain colder and emptier by the week, most teams long gone home, and the upper slopes loaded and shed snow while the Sherpas watched them and said little. And over all of it hung the one fact the Brunos never truly took in, that if anything went wrong up high, no helicopter was coming. The mountain is too remote and too tall, the air too thin for rotors to bite. Anyone in trouble near the top has exactly one hope of getting down, and it is the people climbing beside them. The Brunos had spent 6 weeks teaching those people precisely what they thought of them. And what scares me most about Kangchenjunga is simple. There is no helicopter coming, no rescue from below. The only people who can get you down are the ones standing right next to you. There is one last note in Cassius's records, tapped out in the cold of the high camp on the morning they left for the top. He wrote that Sonam had pulled them aside the night before and told them plainly he did not like the window. The snow too freshly loaded, the timing too tight, the descent too long to gamble on this late, and that he would rather wait. Cassius wrote it down, and then beside it he wrote his own decision, which was that they had not spent this kind of money and this much time to be talked out of the summit by a guide getting cold feet. He noted that the other teams were moving, and that he was not about to let the men he was paying decide whether he got what he came for, and that nothing was going to stand in the way now. When the narrow window came near the end of the season, Sonam did not like it, reading the slopes as dangerously loaded and the window as far too thin for a team this slow. But the Brunos had paid an enormous amount of money for a summit. The season was running out, and a guide can warn a grown man only so many times before he decides for himself. Cassius decided they would go up. When the window came, Candel posted that this was it. She walked her followers through the plan one more time. The climb up to the high camp, a short rest, the start into the dark before midnight, the summit by morning, then the long way down. She wrote that after all the training and all the doubt and all the work, she and Cassius were about to stand on the third highest mountain in the world, a place almost no one they knew could even point to on a map. She told them to watch her page because in a day or two, the next thing they would see would be a photo from the very top of Kangchenjunga, the shot of a lifetime, and signed off, promising the hardest part was almost behind her now. The climb up to the high camp took them far longer than it should have, and they reached it, late and badly worn. Sonam watched them stumble around the camp in the cold, and did the arithmetic they would never do for themselves. The climbing speed against the clock against the bottled oxygen, and he did not like a single number it gave him. The only safe plan was to rest a few hours and start for the summit in the deep, cold well before midnight, so the team would reach the top in the morning with the whole day left to get back down, because on a mountain like this, you climb in the dark precisely so that you descend in the light. But the Brunos were spent and slow to eat, slow to ready their gear, and by the time they finally crawled out of the tents, the night was nearly gone, and the sky was already graying in the east. They were starting their summit day at the hour they should have been finishing the first half of it. The night before they left that high camp, Candel sent one short message out on the satellite device, the way she had from every stop on the mountain. She told everyone the weather looked perfect, that she and Cassius felt strong, that the hardest part was behind them now, and that the very next thing they sent would be a photo from the summit of Kangchenjunga. It was the last message either of them ever sent. The few other teams still on the mountain that late had left for the top in the black of night and were already heading down by the time the Brunos crawled out of their tents, still posing for the camera while the safe hours bled away. The morning climb was slow, and for a while, in the first light, it was even beautiful, the thing they had sold to everyone for a year. But up that high, the air holds only about a third of the oxygen it does at sea level, and even on bottled gas the body comes apart a little more with every step. The handful of other climbers that morning, the only other souls left on the whole cold mountain, had started at a sane hour and passed the Brunos coming down, already done, and more than one looked back at the couple still plodding upward, so late, and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. Sonam and Tashi stayed glued to them, Sonam watching the clouds stack up in a shape he did not like. And still the Brunos climbed, slower and slower, until by late morning they were hours behind the last few people on the mountain, with the summit still above them, and the wind beginning to rise. So Sonam called it. He told them, as clearly as the thin air would let him, that it was over, that they were too slow and too late and too spent, that the summit was not worth what it would cost to keep reaching for it this far behind with that weather coming, and that the only thing that mattered now was turning around while turning around could still save them. He had walked away from summits before and lived to climb again, and he was begging these two to let him do it one more time. It was the most important thing anyone said on that mountain all season, and it came from the one man up there who could see exactly what was about to happen. When the man who has summited this peak and buried friends on it tells you to turn around, you turn around. They answered him by reminding him who paid his wages. I cannot ever get over that. They would not hear it. Cassius reminded Sonam, in the freezing wind near the top of the world, exactly how much he had paid, and exactly who worked for whom, and made it plain they had not come all this way to be turned around a few hundred feet from the summit by their own guide, and so they kept climbing, and Sonam and Tashi, who had not abandoned two people in their care, no matter what those people had called them, climbed on beside them, while the clouds the Brunos refused to believe in stacked higher and darker at their backs. They reached the summit of Kangchenjunga in the early afternoon, hours behind, in a wind that was no longer the gentle thing the forecast had drawn. Sonam and Tashi, the way the Sherpas do, stopped a few steps short of the very top, leaving the final feet untrodden out of respect for the mountain, the way climbers have for generations. The Brunos did not. They walked straight onto the highest point, planted themselves on the sacred summit for the camera, and Candel got the photographs she had promised everyone. And then they turned to start down, into a sky gone flat and heavy and gray. The first hard gusts already tearing across the ridge, carrying snow, and the temperature falling off a cliff. They finally got their photo, but I promise you, the summit is the easy half of Kangchenjunga. It is the long way back down that kills you, and they were starting it already broken and far too late. The descent was the very thing Sonam had feared since the first rotation. The weather closed over the upper mountain, and the world shrank to the little circle the headlamps could light. The wind tearing at them, fresh snow swallowing the steps they had kicked on the way up. The overlong day had burned through their bottled oxygen, and somewhere up there the gas ran low and then ran out, and without it, at that height, in that cold, the body fails fast. Candel was the first to go. She began to slow, then to stumble, then to sink down into the snow, the way utterly spent climbers do in the last hour before the end. And Cassius, who had treated the whole mountain like a thing he had purchased, would not leave his wife. Sonam and Tashi did everything two human beings can do. They got them up, short-roped them, fought the wind and the dark and the dead weight of two people who each outweighed them, hauling them foot by foot down ground that fell away into nothing. And then Sonam and Tashi reached the very edge of what a human being can do at that altitude. There is a point on a mountain like this where the people who stay will simply die beside the ones they are trying to save, where the only choice left is a monstrous one. Climb down and live, or stay and let Kangchenjunga take all four. Neither of the Brunos could stand on their own any longer, and two exhausted freezing men cannot carry two grown adults down 45 degrees of ice in a storm in the dark with no help coming and none even possible. They stayed long past the point of sense, long past anything the Brunos had ever earned, until staying one more minute would have killed them too. And then the men Cassius Bruno had called slaves were forced to turn their backs and climb down alone, carrying a weight no amount of anyone's money could ever lift back it off. Think about what those two men did. They stayed with people who treated them like dirt until the mountain almost took them too, then climbed down alone. I do not know how you carry that. That descent down to the high camp was the kind of thing that ages a man overnight, half frozen, picking their way down ground they could barely see. Sonam and Tashi reached the tents and Nirusursen could do nothing, then but wait, listening to the storm tear at the nylon and watching the dark for two headlamps that were never going to come. No call came from the satellite device, and even if one had, it would have changed nothing, because nothing flies into a Kangchenjunga storm in the dark, and the Brunos had stopped far above any rescue. They did not come in the night. They did not come at first light. By the time the weather broke enough for anyone to look, every person on that mountain already understood what it had decided. Cassius and Candel Bruno never came down off Kangchenjunga. They died high on the mountain that night, somewhere on the long, brutal descent that kills more climbers than the climb ever does, far above any place a rescue could reach, in the storm their forecast had sworn would hold off. The couple who had treated a whole team of mountain people like property they had bought were stopped, in the end, by the one thing that has never taken a payment and never will, a mountain on the edge of Nepal that does exactly what it wants and was never for a moment impressed by anything they owned. Sonam and Tashi came down to base camp alive, frostbitten and hollowed out. The expedition company began the grim work that follows, notifying the liaison officer, the district authorities below, and, through the embassy, the families still waiting on a photo from the summit. A helicopter could only sweep the lower mountain because the Brunos had died far too high to reach, and Kangchenjunga did not give them back the way it has kept others who vanished on that same descent and were never found. What came down instead was the record of it, the bright, confident posts, the captions calling those men the help, and the private notes of a man who had counted the people, keeping him alive as things he owned. Honestly, the men he called slaves were the last people still trying to save them. The ones he treated like property were the only people up there who acted like a life mattered at all. Sonam had read those two the day he met them, the way the Sherpas do, because what they know cannot be bought, only earned one hard season at a time. He had known, and went up and fought for them anyway, because that is what those men do. Cassius and Candel Bruno were not monsters, just people who had spent their lives able to pay for whatever they wanted, until they made the oldest mistake there is and came to believe other people were part of what the money bought. Kangchenjunga did not care what they had paid or what they had called the team. The only people up there who treated them as more than a transaction were the men they had decided they owned.